Hey everyone, welcome to Wishing Well BBQ. I'm Dustin Wells, and today I'm going to give you the ultimate brisket guide. Let's do it. We just recently reached 500 subscribers, and I wanted to give you guys a super awesome video that I get asked to do all the time: brisket. Brisket is the creme de la creme of all of barbecue, and it's one of the most difficult pieces of meat to smoke. And that's because brisket has a tendency to be super tough, and you really have to smoke it and cook it just right to get it perfect. But you don't have to be intimidated to cook a brisket anymore. I'm gonna teach you how to be the ultimate pitmaster and how to master this piece of meat. In this video, I'm gonna break down everything you need to know as far as trimming, seasoning, smoking, wrapping, slicing, and eating this brisket. In the description below, I've added timestamps for all of the different steps that I'm gonna take to prepare this brisket. If you need to skip any of the steps and move on to the next one, you can just go down below in the description and click on the step that you want to watch. Let me take you back to 3 a.m. from the night before so I can show you what we have to do to get this brisket ready for the smoker. All right, it is 3 in the morning and the smell of coffee is in the air. Trust me, we're gonna need it today. We've got quite a long cook ahead of us. A brisket's usually gonna take about 12 or 14 hours to get that perfect smoke flavor and to get it perfectly tender. So we want to make sure you get it on early. You always wanna take how long you think it's gonna take and add about 2 or 3 hours. You definitely don't want dinner time to come around and people are waiting and the brisket is just not ready. So make sure you give yourself plenty of time for this cook. You can always let it rest in a cooler for several hours before dinner. There's a couple of things that I want to really talk about to make sure that you have a successful brisket cook. The number one thing that I want to talk to you about is brisket selection. I got this 15-pound brisket at Sam's Club, and this is a prime grade piece of beef. You can get prime at Sam's or Costco or really any butcher shop. And I always like to say to get prime because prime is going to be a good insurance policy for you. It's going to have a lot more flavor, it's going to be a lot more tender, and you're going to have a higher rate of success when you cook a prime grade brisket. That doesn't necessarily mean that if you use choice, you're gonna have a bad brisket, but prime is always gonna be better. So spend the little bit of extra money to get prime if you can. When I'm at the store and I'm looking for a brisket, there's a couple of things I always look for. Number one, I'm always looking to see that the flat is nice and thick. Some briskets have a really thin flat, and that's not really any good. It's gonna dry out, it's gonna burn up, it's not gonna be a good piece. I'm also going to pick the brisket up and see how flexible it is in the package. If it's super flexible, that probably means it has a good amount of intermuscular fat, and it means that it's had plenty of time to wet age, so it's gonna be more tender. And the last thing that I look for is plenty of intermuscular fat. You can flip the brisket over to the meat side and you can see all of the intermuscular fat, and I'm gonna show you plenty of that here in just a second. The more intermuscular fat I see running through the beef, the more tender and the more flavor it's gonna have. Overall, just make sure that you pick a good quality brisket. Make sure you feel around that it's nice and flexible, and make sure it has plenty of marbling because that's gonna give you the best quality product. Now, before I trim this brisket, I'm gonna put it in the freezer for about 30 to 40 minutes. Just plenty of time to make sure that the fat gets nice and hard. It's gonna be super easy to trim if we do that. If it's kind of warm, your knife can slip on the fat and it can just not be good. So make sure you have a nice hard fat, but you don't want it completely frozen. I've taken this brisket out of the cryovac, and I'm telling you right now, this can be a very intimidating thing because you've got this 15-pound piece of meat here and there's so much going on and it's kind of intimidating. I'm going to show you a 4-step process to make sure when you're trimming this brisket, you hit everything that you need to and you're super successful. Trimming is a very important part of this process, and we want to make sure we do it right. Now, I am going to tell you, you're actually going to trim off way more fat and way more meat than you think that you need to. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're wasting anything. You just want to put the best possible quality meat on the smoker. One thing that I really like to say is if I don't want to eat it in the end, I definitely don't want to spend the time cooking it. So I want to make sure that most of this brisket is ready to eat as soon as it comes off the smoker. Before I get started, I'm just going to take a paper towel and dab this brisket dry. I definitely don't want it to be wet whenever I've got a knife and I'm trying to cut through some of this fat. I want it to be as dry as possible. The first thing that I'm going to do in this 4-step process is square up this brisket and get the shape that I want. I typically like to start with the sides. A lot of time when these briskets are getting processed by the butcher, when they run them through the bandsaw, they get some steam on there and you get a little bit of gray meat on the side. So what I like to do is I like to go ahead and just cut right through this. And it's also going to allow you to see how much fat you actually have on top of this beef. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna trim all the way down this side. And I don't really have to go too far. I'm just gonna kind of square it up. That way I can see what's going on down here. And today, I don't want to waste any of this fat. I'm actually going to use it to make some beef tallow that we're going to use later on today. So I've got this bowl that I'm going to put that extra fat and all these trimmings into. So I'm just going to slide through, and I want to make this brisket as aerodynamic as possible. So I'm just going to slice right down the side here. Now on this side, you can see that I've got a nice, clean, and even cut all the way down the side of the brisket. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to work my way around this brisket. I've got this extra thick flap up here. This is where the Kansas City burnt ends are going to come from, right around this area. But this isn't really the best quality right here. So I'm going to go ahead and cut that off because it is going to burn up. Now I get a nice look down this side. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take my knife and I'm just going to start trimming some of this off and squaring it away. Get some of this nice and rounded off. Now you can see that I can really see this outside edge of the beef and I can really see how thick this fat band is. I'm gonna flip it around and make sure that I don't have any of that gray meat. I typically like to trim this little end off just to make it nice and rounded. I'm gonna flip this brisket over now for the next part. I want to trim the outside edge of this so that I know when this brisket is done which way the grain is running. Something that's super important is you've got to slice against the grain whenever this brisket is done. And it's kind of hard to see where that grain is running if you already have the brisket cooked. As I look at this brisket, I see that the grain is running this way. So what I want to do is I want to take my knife and I want to go ahead and slice off this end piece here. So that way, whenever this is done, I can take my knife and I can make slices. And I know that I'm going to fan out because the grain starts to kind of come this way as I get closer to the point of the brisket. So this is going to help me know right where to slice. All right, that is the end of the first step of this process. We have a really nice shape on this brisket. It's nice and rounded. The edges are squared off. We don't have any really thin pieces of meat here. Everything's nice and even. So now we're gonna move on to the second step. The second part in this process is trimming out the deckle. And the deckle is this band of fat that runs through these two muscles. If you didn't know, the brisket has two separate muscles. It has the point end and the flat end. If I flip it over, the point end is going to be this thicker side that has a lot more intermuscular fat. And then the flat end is going to be this end that's, well, like the name says, it's kind of flat compared to the point. Your flat is going to be a lot more of a lean meat, and then your point is going to be a lot fattier. You can imagine that the point is going to be like a ribeye texture, and then your flat is going to be more of like a sirloin type texture. And the deckle is this huge band of fat that separates these muscles. And if we leave it in there, it's going to leave this humongous chunk of fat that's honestly just not going to render down. So we want to make sure that we trim that out as much as possible. On this side, you can tell where the deckle is because when you grab it, I mean, it is like super hard. So you want to make sure you get your knife and you want to trim that out as much as possible. Now, if you trim all the way through, you will separate the muscles and you don't necessarily want to do that. As you see, just a little bit of meat comes out of there, but this fat is not going to render, so you've got to make sure you get rid of it. And this really exposes how much marbling you have in this brisket. I'm telling you, prime grade is the way to go. I'm gonna turn this brisket around and you can see that there is still on this side a massive band of fat. If we leave that in there, oh man, that's not gonna render. It's gonna be super chewy and it's just not gonna be a good product. So what I like to do is get my knife, go down in there a little bit and just start trimming some of this out slowly but surely. In here and cut it out a little bit. Cut some more of this out here. And get through and cut some of it right here as well. I'm using my Spaceman boning knife. This is the Constellation series. If you wanna check out this knife, the link is in the description below. This is the perfect knife for doing this delicate trimming. I'll get in here and get some of the rest of this out. One thing that I can do is I can kind of aim my knife inward a little bit and at an angle. Just get a nice little cut in there and then go on the other side of this and start to go inside and I'll scoop some of this fat out. And that's about the most that I want to take out of there, because if I keep going in, I'm going to separate these muscles, so I don't want to do that. So now that I've got the deckle taken care of, that ends part 2. The third thing that I need to do is take care of all this silver skin and fat on the bottom side of the brisket. You can see that on the bottom side of this brisket, we have a lot of this fat here, and we even have some silver skin. Now you can spend all day long trimming on this, but you just trim it to the best of your ability. So I'm gonna take my knife and I'm just gonna kind of press it down and I'm gonna keep it parallel because I don't wanna take off too much meat. But I'm just gonna kind of lift up on this fat and trim it off. To get under the silver skin, I can just get right on the edge here, stab my knife through there and follow along, make a little tab, and then slowly pull up as I cut. I've got the flat end completely trimmed the way that I want to, so let's move to the point. You can see we've got some extra fat down here on the bottom, so I'm just gonna trim that out, get as much of that out as I can. Make sure there's no silver skin on there. On this side, I've got a little bit of hard fat. I'm just gonna trim through that. And that does it for the third step. I got as much of that silver skin off on the flat and the point as I could, and took off any of that extra fat, and just made sure that I still had that nice uniform rounded shape on this brisket. So now I'm gonna flip it over for the fourth and final part of this brisket trim. So now we've got this brisket flipped over to the fat side. And what we want is we want on the flat part of the brisket, we want about 1/4 inch of fat. Now there's really 2 ways you can go about trimming the point. A lot of people like to take all of this top fat off because the point already has so much intermuscular fat that you don't really need this. That's the route that I typically like to take, but if you just really want that extra fat on there, just leave it at about 1/4 inch. So I always like to actually start at the point. And like I said previously, I'm gonna take most of the fat off of the top of the point. You can see that the point is round up here at the top and then kind of goes down into the flat. And that's where these 2 muscles meet, is probably about right in here. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna start at the top part of this and I'm just gonna start trimming some of this extra fat off. And if I make a nice little tab, I can pull up on it and kind of let the weight do the work and just let my knife kind of slide down and it'll take off some of this fat. Now, as I start getting down towards the flat, I really just want to take it to about 1/4 inch. So this is what I can kind of use to see if I'm getting 1/4 inch of fat on the top. That's really why we cut some of this side off, so that we could see this. So this is it. This is our trimmed brisket. So we've got plenty of intermuscular fat running through the point here that we're gonna be okay, and we're still gonna be able to get a really awesome bark on this point. And the flat has about 1/4 inch of fat all the way across, and it's nice and even through this brisket. So each slice is gonna have a nice even band of fat on the top of it. And that's all we have to do to get our brisket nice and trimmed. The bottom side is nice and cleaned up. We still have plenty of intermuscular fat. Let's move on to the next part of injecting this brisket. We're gonna make a homemade injection today with only 2 simple ingredients. And this is gonna help give us an insurance policy for plenty of moisture inside of this brisket, as well as give some extra flavor. Let's make this injection. The first ingredient I'm going to use in this injection is beef broth. I really want to pump this brisket up, so I'm going to use about half of this carton. And the second ingredient is soy sauce. I'm going to use about a 1/4 cup of soy sauce. This is going to add some saltiness to the beef. And that's it. That's all I'm going to use in this injection. Today I'm using my pistol grip injector, and the way that I want to inject this brisket is by going in a checkerboard pattern. I'm going to start at the bottom end of the flat, and I'm going to go in about 2-inch increments. So I'm just going to start right here in the point, and I'm just going to kind of stab around to make a pocket. I'm just going to slowly give a few pumps. It tends to work better if you go with the grain. You're going to get some kickback, and that's perfectly okay. Even though the point of the brisket has a lot of intermuscular fat, it's not going to hurt it to go ahead and inject that too. Because all that's going to do is add a little bit of extra flavor. Flip it over and make sure I've got all this under here injected. As you can see, we did get plenty of that injection kickback. Trust me, we pumped a whole bunch into this brisket. Now it's time to season. And for our binder, we're actually just going to use this leftover injection that's all over the brisket. There are all kinds of brisket and beef rubs that you could use whenever you're making a brisket. However, I just like to go pretty simple. And I'm just going to use a combination of salt, pepper, and garlic. I'm going to put these seasonings on separately because I want to know exactly how much salt, how much pepper, and how much garlic I'm putting on this brisket. So I'm first going to start with some coarse kosher salt. And a brisket is a pretty large piece of meat, so you can actually go pretty heavy on the salt. If you think you're putting too much salt, you're probably not putting enough. So make sure you really get the salt on there. So I'm going to make sure I'm getting a nice even distribution of seasoning. Make sure you get the edges. When you get the salt on, you want to make sure you pat it down into the meat. Never rub against the meat. I've got my salt on the brisket, and you can tell it's nice and even across the brisket, and it's actually pretty heavy. Next, I'm going to use some table grind black pepper, and I really like a lot of pepper on my brisket. Perfect. The last thing I'm going to use is some granulated garlic. And you want to make sure you use granulated, that way it doesn't clump up. And this is perfect. This is exactly what I'm looking for when I'm seasoning my brisket. The seasoning is nice and heavy. That's going to give us a really good flavor and a really awesome bark. Now let's flip this brisket over and do the same thing to the other side. Oh yeah, that is a beautiful sight. Let's go outside and get our pit running. Today I'm cooking on my 500-gallon propane tank smoker that we call the Beast, and we're gonna keep our temperatures pretty low and slow at about 225 to 250 degrees. We're gonna be using straight hickory wood today. I've got my pit nice and fired up, so now I'm gonna put this brisket on the smoker. Now I wanna kind of bunch it up so that it gets a nice thickness to it. And I'm gonna face the point towards the fire. The point can take a little bit more heat. There's always the question of fat side up or fat side down. And to me, it depends on what cooker you're cooking on. If you're cooking primarily on a smoker that the heat comes from the bottom, you want to put the fat side down. If you have a heat that's coming across, or even a ceramic cooker that the heat comes around the top and goes down, you want to have the fat on top. Now we've got our brisket on the smoker, and all we have to do at this point is maintain our fire and keep it between 225 and 250 degrees. I have a challenge for you, and it's probably the hardest challenge. I don't want you to look at this brisket for at least 3 hours. That's when we're gonna come back and we're gonna see the progress of this. So we'll come back and check on it then. All right, I hope you followed the rules. It's been 3 hours since we put this brisket on. Hey, we have daylight. That's pretty nice to have. All right, let's check out this brisket. Oh yeah, that looks absolutely fantastic. It doesn't quite have that full brisket look that I'm looking for, the really dark bark. However, I can tell just by feeling it that the bark is starting to get nice and crunchy, and that seasoning is starting to adhere to the meat. Some of that fat is starting to render out. This is exactly what I'm looking for at about the 3-hour mark. We've still got about another 5 hours in the smoke, so during that time, we're gonna continue to build bark on this brisket. Right now, the internal temperature of the brisket is 138 degrees. In the beginning stages of the cook, the brisket is gonna rise in temperature relatively quickly. Let's close this brisket down and let it keep on cooking. All right, we have had this brisket on for an additional 5 hours, and that's a total cook time unwrapped of 8 hours. Let's check it out. Man, oh man, just check out this brisket. This is exactly what we're looking for right before the wrapping phase. You can see that that fat is really starting to render, and what I'm really looking for is this fantastic bark and this beautiful color. I'm also looking to make sure that the seasoning has adhered to the meat, and if I rub on the fat and kind of push down on it, it's starting to split. So that's starting to tell me that we're in the phase where we need to wrap this brisket up. There are several different ways that you can wrap up a brisket. You can use aluminum foil, which is sometimes called the Texas crutch. You can use butcher paper, or you can just let it ride all the way until it's done. Personally, I like to use butcher paper for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's going to allow a little bit of steam to release through the paper, and it will preserve our bark just a little bit better than aluminum foil. Aluminum foil has a tendency to give you a little bit of a pot roast kind of flavor, just because it really traps all of that moisture and steam in the foil. Today, I used my brisket trimmings to make some homemade beef tallow. I didn't include this recipe in today's video, but if you would like to see how I make it, let me know in the comment section below, and I'll make a video on how to do this. I want to add this beef tallow to the paper for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's going to give me a little bit of extra fat in the paper, and number two, it's going to help preserve some of that beefy flavor. If you don't have beef tallow, you can really just use melted butter if you want to, but it's going to change the flavor profile just a little bit. And honestly, you don't even have to do this step. I just think that it gives you a little bit higher quality of a product. I'm just gonna open up this beef tallow and I'm just gonna squirt it on the paper, right around where the brisket's gonna be. I don't have to go too terribly heavy with it. Man, I tell you what, this brisket just looks absolutely fantastic and it smells awesome. I'm gonna get just a touch more of my beef tallow, and I'm just gonna kind of put a little bit on the top of this brisket. That way we've got some of that extra fat on there. I've got 2 pieces of butcher paper and they're overlapping each other just a little bit because this is a very wide piece of meat. So I'm gonna take both pieces, put them over the brisket just like this. Make sure I get it on there nice and tight. I'll come through and I'm just gonna fold this side. Do the same thing with this side. Now I'm just gonna take this brisket and flip it. Make sure that paper is still nice and tight. May have to fold it a little bit more. Flip it once more. And that's it. That's exactly how I'm gonna wrap this brisket. Let's go put it back on the smoker. I'm gonna go ahead and put this probe in the thickest part of the flat, and now I'm really gonna be monitoring temperatures. Our brisket has reached an internal temperature of 160 degrees, and that's exactly where the stall typically happens. The stall happens when the meat is sweating out all of that moisture, and it has a hard time continuing to go up in temperature. This loss of moisture is causing the meat to cool itself down, and sometimes the stall can last between 45 minutes and 3 hours. But don't worry, we're gonna try our best to combat that issue. And we're gonna combat that issue by cranking up our smoker to 275 degrees. By this point, we are perfectly fine raising up the temperature of the smoker. It's not going to negatively impact the meat. We're gonna leave this brisket wrapped up until the internal temperature reaches about 195 degrees to 205 degrees. Now I know that 10 degrees is a big difference, especially when we're trying to finish up this brisket. But when the brisket's done, I'm gonna show you exactly what to look for so that you know the brisket is ready to come off the smoker and go into the rest period. Let's crank up the pit and let it keep on cooking, and we'll come right back to you. All right, we have reached the 4-hour mark with this brisket wrapped up in the butcher paper, and our internal temperature is about 203 degrees. Let's go ahead and check it out. There's not really too much to see with it wrapped in the butcher paper, so let's take it over here to the table so we can unwrap it and check it out. I want to unwrap it in an aluminum pan, so that way if any juices come out, we get to keep those. One thing I can tell you right off the bat is this butcher paper is covered in rendered fat, and let me tell you, it smells amazing. I didn't only go by temperature to tell that it was done. We're gonna do just a couple of things, and I wanna show you what to look for to know that this brisket is ready to pull off of the smoker. I can feel around and tell that the brisket inside is very flexible. I've got my probe here, and I'm really just kind of feeling around for tenderness. Oh yeah, that goes through there like butter. Now that I know this brisket is done, I'm gonna go ahead and wrap it back up in the butcher paper, and we're gonna let it rest for at least an hour. You can really let a brisket rest for up to 6 hours. As long as it's in a cooler, just make sure that you vent the cooler every once in a while so that it doesn't build up too much steam and continue cooking. All right, I have let this brisket rest for about an hour, and let me tell you something, I just about can't stand it anymore. You know what time it is. I've got to slice into this and take a bite. But before I do, let's review what we did to get here. The first thing I did was go to the store and get a 15-pound prime brisket. In order to trim this brisket, I had to do a 4-step process. Number 1 was squaring the brisket up. Number 2 was taking care of the deckle. Number 3 was taking all of the silver skin and fat off of the bottom part of the brisket. And number 4 was trimming the fat on top to 1/4 inch thick. Then I made a homemade injection using beef broth and soy sauce. Then I seasoned the brisket on all sides liberally with salt, pepper, and garlic. Then we put it on the smoker between 225 and 250 degrees. We let it sit in the smoker unwrapped for 8 hours. Then we wrapped up the brisket in butcher paper and put some of our homemade beef tallow on the brisket. The brisket was wrapped in the smoker for 4 hours. Then we let the brisket rest for 1 additional hour. And now here we are, and I'm gonna show you how we're gonna slice this brisket. Oh man, this is like the best Christmas present you can have. Just check this out. This brisket looks absolutely phenomenal. And you can tell that that fat is just perfectly rendered. And I can tell just by kind of pressing down, my finger wants to go straight through that fat. Now, the process for slicing this brisket is actually pretty simple, but we have to make sure that we do it correctly. And I'm gonna show you how to do that. First off, if you look right here, this is that corner that we trim to show us which way the grain is running. And if I flip this brisket over, you can actually see that grain, the direction that it's running. Now remember, this brisket has 2 different muscles on it. We have the point end over here and we have the flat end. We're gonna actually slice these differently because the grain is running a different direction. So the first thing that I want to do, if I'm serving a crowd and some people want a more fatty piece and some people want a more lean piece, I'm gonna separate them right down the middle so that I can better serve my guests. Now I can actually kind of move this point end and see where that fat starts to wiggle a little bit, and that's where those 2 muscles are separated. So what I want to do is I just want to take my knife and I want to follow straight down that edge. Look how juicy this brisket is. You know I've got to do the squeeze test and just look at the juices running out of that brisket. You know this is perfectly cooked. The first part that I want to show you is how to slice the flat. So I have my 12-inch slicing knife, and what I want to do is I want to do about 1/4 inch slices. This is the ultimate brisket test to see if you cooked it correctly. I'm gonna pick a slice right out of the middle here and just check out this smoke ring that we got. We're gonna do the bend test. So I've got this brisket slice here, and I'm just gonna hold it between my fingers, and if it folds over just like this, that is a perfectly cooked brisket. And then also with this brisket, I just barely have to pull, and it just comes right apart. Now I'm gonna show you how I slice the point. Now I have the point meat here, and we have to go against the grain as well. But the grain is actually running this way, even though we made our slice right here. So what you wanna do is take your knife and just go right down the middle, and I'm gonna turn it this way, and I'm gonna slice against the grain. And on the flat, I did 1/4 inch slices, but over here, I wanna do a little bit thicker, probably about 3/8 of an inch. We can see that we also have a smoke ring on this point, and that fat in the middle where that deckle was is perfectly rendered. Hey, I don't know about you, but I am ready to take a bite of this. All right, this has been a super long cook, about 14 hours in total, and I am ready to see how we did on this brisket. And I tell you what, I already know we did great. Let me start with the flat. That is just perfectly tender. Hey, cheers to 500 subscribers, cheers to an awesome cook, and cheers to you. Take a bite. That fat literally just melts in your mouth. It is rendered perfectly. And it has so much flavor from those juices from the injection. The salt, pepper, and garlic is the perfect seasoning for a brisket. Hey, let's get a piece from the point. Man, I'll tell you what, that is the ultimate brisket. You have absolutely got to try this recipe. It is a showstopper, and brisket is king. And if you master this, you are gonna be the best pit master in your neighborhood, guaranteed. Thank you so much for watching today's video. If you enjoy what we're doing here on the Wishing Well BBQ channel, make sure you hit that subscribe button so that you don't miss out on any of the fun. Make sure you also follow us on all of our other socials, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Remember, if you're interested in buying my Wishing Well BBQ competition dry rub, make sure you send me a DM on one of my social media platforms or email me at wishingwellbbq@gmail.com. Thank you so much again for watching, and as always, we'll see you next time.